Hello. Welcome to Senior, where folks from our town interview other Harpswell seniors so that we can all get to know each other better and celebrate Harpswell's eclectic older population. If you'd like to interview someone or you would like to be interviewed, please send us an email to HAH at ha.community. And the email address will be at the end of this program. ha.community is the email. Today, we are delighted to have Robert McIntyre, who lives on Basin Point Road on Harpswell Neck. And he founded Harpswell Heritage Apples about 15 years ago. And he's going to talk to us about the organization and why Harpswell apples are important. Welcome, Robert. What made you decide to form Harpswell Heritage Apples? All that 2006, was it?
2006. Well, I was at the point of abandoning my hopeless but noble attempt to bring credit cooperatives to Russia. And Dorothy Rosenberg, my spouse, and Sharon Whitney and Don Clifford, her spouse, got together to taste some apples we'd found locally. And we concluded they were of much higher quality than we could get in the supermarket, and yet they were falling off the trees and being left to rot. And we decided it would be a really good idea to try and find out what variety they were. They're obviously from really old trees where you put your arms, that's a really old tree. And we sought out John Bunker, the expert in the state, not the state expert, but the expert in the state with MAFCA and FEDCO to get them identified, because the state threw up its hands and said, we don't do anything with old apples. Go see John Bunker. That was at High Moor Farm between Waterville and Lewiston, which is the experiment station for orchards, but they're all the worthless apples like McIntyre, which have no flavor, character, or interest, according to the
According to your opinion, yeah, okay.
Right, and so it was really Sharon and Dorothy and Robert that founded Harpswell Heritage Apples. Don Clifford working full-time in engineering and construction work. So it was three of us. And we've shared decision-making all along. We are not registered as a charitable organization because we never went through the legal expense and the time of doing it. We always thought it was going to be short-term, but here we are 14 years later, and there it is. So what we do is we charge a low, decent price for what we provide, and we plant the trees in some cases as well. And all of our proceeds, minus our direct cost of buying things, are then donated to local charities, schools, land trusts, fire departments, and food programs in the pandemic. So we're sort of a nonprofit, but we're not legally.
Right. Well, I know you've donated to HA too, because we really appreciate it. But, you know, I think everybody, as they drive around, they see apple trees in the fall in particular, and in the spring when the blossoms are there. But so when you were out looking for trees, do you find the soil is so different all around Harpswell? Do you find trees in all the areas of Harpswell?
Yes, everywhere. So everywhere you go, you will see both the remains of really old, interesting trees and wild apples. And what people need to understand is apples never, ever breed true from seed. So you take apple seeds, you'll get something, but it won't bear any resemblance to the apple that it came from. And so any apple that you know of that has a name that's been honored over time or commercially developed has been grafted. A root has something added to it, cut off an existing tree of the variety. So every Golden Delicious you've ever seen is a graft. There are no wild Golden Delicious. Maybe there was one 400 years ago somewhere, but from that point on, it is cloning. So John Bunker taught us how to do this. So in some cases, the trees that we sell to be planted in Harpswell are our work. And in some cases, they are FEDCO's work through John Bunker and MAFCA, because they're expert and do it on a really high scientific level.
So will you explain who John Bunker is? I mean, you sort of said it, but like
John Bunker contradicts the case that no one worthwhile ever graduates from Colby College. Um, and
Spoken like a Bowdoin guy. Yeah.
teasing. Um, and he went back to nature in the 70s and was involved in agricultural self-sufficiency in Palermo, Maine, near Augusta, and stayed. And he immediately started observing hundreds of enormous old apple trees that were ignored and had these wonderful tasting apples. And when he'd ask around, people would say, oh yeah, that's a this or that's a that. They'd have a name for it. And he then started to follow it up, and he realized that these varieties were dying out in actual cultivation, that the trees can last 200, 300, 400 years under ideal circumstances, but it's capricious. Lightning or a vehicle runs into them, or voles get at them at a particular moment and kill the bark at the ground level and they die. So there's a vulnerability. So he set off as a lifetime task of first finding and then validating what they were, and then producing them on a semi-commercial scale. So that's what Fedco sells. When Fedco sells trees or bushes or agricultural supplies, it's a carrying out of that original mission of finding a way to keep these things going. And people who are exposed to them, unless they're just totally emotionally attached to the blandness and general ickiness of an apple like McIntyre, will say, oh, what an interesting apple. I didn't know apples tasted like this. And they go in very different directions. You might like one, and you might not like another of the old varieties. But there was a tremendous variety for reasons. In the period prior to 1900, any farmstead in Harpswell or elsewhere in Maine would have 10 to 14 apple trees, and they would all be grafted, and they would have been selected in order to have apples to save until now. For instance, I had a Baldwin apple for breakfast this morning with yogurt and raspberries. So for storage, those were called winter keeper apples, or for immediate use in making applesauce or canned in some form, or for making cider, which was the core reason to have apple trees for a couple hundred years. So the orchard would be a couple of these, a couple of those, and maybe a couple that were for the livestock. So the apple orchard, not a commercial orchard, but an orchard for self-use, was a normal part of the rural household and urban fringe households in Maine until very recently. And that's what you see on all parts of Harpswell. The problem is you have a mixture of the wild apples, which grow like weeds, actually. It's a shock in Harpswell what a propitious environment it is for apple trees. Why? Who knows? But when they've got any soil at all, they can last a really long time. And so scattered around Harpswell are 150 to 200-year-old apple trees when you find them. And often they have little tiny apples as a result of malnutrition and having grown tightly together, branch on top of branch. So if you have an old apple tree and you want to try and bring it back, one of the things you do is you prune out some of the branches that are interfering with each other directly. So there's more airspace. Fewer apples try to ripen, and so the tree has more energy for the ones that do. And there's more sunlight, and there'll be fewer insects and so on. The other thing you do is you correct the nutrition. There's calcium everywhere in the soil, but it's not in a form that an apple tree can absorb. So you can give the apple tree a sort of transfusion of life with available calcium fertilizer. Fedco sells something called Ancients Arise in 50-pound bags. You spread a bag around the roots of not the roots, but the branch line, not immediately around the trunk, but out a little bit. And do that once for a tree, and then wait a couple years and maybe do it another time. And like we did with the first tree we focused on, the apple tree adjoining Mitchell Field on the property of Harpswell Neck Fire and Rescue, which is the tree called Firehouse. It is a wonderful, sublime apple, and the apples were rotting on the ground, except for one wise local person who would come and pick them up for his or her own use. And so as soon as we cut away, much of what appeared to be the tree was actually a invasive vine growing off the fence. There wasn't much of a tree there, but as soon as it had been fertilized and given a little sunlight, immediately the apples became much larger. Now, 14 years later, it's very close to dead. When we started, it had no trunk. It was a hollow thing with a little rim around it, and there was about this much live trunk, but yet it could support the tree above it. And you can get that result with any tree with some kind of a fertilizer like that and a little bit of pruning. I know that Lily was going to bring up the question of, can you cut blossoms off? And this connects directly at this moment. Apple trees are like a privet hedge. They can be pruned at any time under any circumstances. They never, ever bleed. Hard. Somebody who has a birch tree troubling their life would say that's hard to believe, but it's true. But the only time you shouldn't prune them, for sure, is when they are in blossom. When they're in blossom, the tree will react to cutting off the branch by trying to put out 5 or 8 or 10 new branches at exactly that spot over the next year. So the best time to prune is now, or
February or March,
or April. But before the tree really gets going. And it's important not to prune too heavily, to never take more than 1/3 of the total body of the branches down in a given year. Take off the obvious ones and wait, and then the next year take off a few more obvious ones and adopt a sort of patient approach.
well, when people do prune, if they do have an old overgrown apple tree on their property and they want to prune out, good rule of thumb, not more than 1/3. But is there any value in saving any of those? Are there people that want to use them as scions, or is that something they just throw away or use as apple wood in their fireplace?
I would say you can call this number.
Like an infomercial, love it.
Right. No, and Dorothy Rosenberg or I will discuss with you the situation. There's no purpose in scions have to be cut in winter. So the scion has to be cut in, it could even be if a cold December, but January or February or maybe into March. But you then take the scions, you put them in 3 layers of plastic bagging and you put them in the refrigerator. And you put them in sort of idling until nature begins to really function. You've got a root from some source. They can be acquired from Fedco, proper root, Russian root, because it's able to deal with crummy soil and very hard winters. And you take that root, and as soon as the root starts to want to be growing, you then go into the refrigerator, you take out the scion, you make the proper cut, and you attach it to the rootstock. And if you've done it carefully, the rootstock concludes that the scion is its friend and the nutrition goes exclusively to that. And everything above the graft point is the new type apple, the scion, not the root. It's got nothing to do with the root, except it draws its nutritional support and fluid.
Oh, that's interesting. The thing is, we're almost out of time, but I know one question that people have too is in Harpswell, the winter moth and the brown-tail moth are such a problem. And I know in our apple trees, we have a real big problem with those. But are you saying that people who have that problem with their tree can just clip those or call you, or what should they do?
No, you can clip the the brown-tail moth nests now. Now is actually the only useful time to do it. And you can
Meaning
see,
February or March or early
yeah,
March.
yeah.
Mhm.
You can't clip winter moth nests because there aren't any. They're just little eggs already laid on the branches. And there's a long story about what to do to try and deal with them. Again, if you're determined to do that, call us and we can send you an email explanation of what people do there. It's not all that easy.
Yeah, I know. We wouldn't
And
have so many.
they're
But
very
I guess it's getting better, so maybe time is on our side that way.
okay.
But
So wait, we're running out of time. You wanted to know about the Heritage Orchard, which is the thing that Bunker has set up as a perpetual repository for live trees of all these old varieties. There's Calendar, which we have a few and we would sell for a large donation. And it has, for instance, as January, this stunning photograph of one of my favorite apples called Black Oxford, originating by a wild deviation in Oxford County, Maine, and so on. The varieties that you can get are very large and very diverse. I'm especially fond of Baldwin, which was Maine's major export apple in 1860 or 1870 or 1880. You could find them in barrels on the street in London because they were so durable, so free of vulnerability to pest, and they lasted so long they could be shipped in normal ocean commercial transit and then sold in Europe. They're wonderful, they last forever. They're wonderful for cooking, for everything. And I have a favorite apple recipe. And if anyone wants it, it'll be in the, actually it's not mine, it's Dorothy's foolproof tartine, which is, and it sounds complicated, an upside down French apple tart. It's sublime. And there's a very simple 7-stage how to make it, which anybody who cooks at all will say, that's not more complicated than a regular apple pie. But it is wonderful, wonderful, and it works with various types of apples, but not mushy things like McIntyre.
well, like a Baldwin would be good. Any keeper apple would be good. That'd be great.
But
Well, we'll have that available.
Yeah.
We'll have that
Okay.
available at the ha.community. We can email that recipe to people. So that's great. Well, thank you, Robert. This is great. What a wonderful introduction and more knowledge about what people with apple trees should do. And obviously put that phone number up one more time for the absolute,
Okay.
absolute extra stuff. And thanks for this look.
And you should be aware that there are many Harpswell apples already in the Mafka Heritage Orchard. Harpswell has proven to be a happy hunting ground for some unknown reason. Maybe nobody had looked until we looked, but there are lots of unusual old variety apple trees here that are hard to find or not found elsewhere.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Special thanks to Harpswell Community TV and to the Health and Wellness Chapter Committee of Harpswell Aging at Home for sponsoring our program today.